An 8-year-old boy sits barefoot on an upside-down bucket. His sister lies motionless on his lap. Both of their lips are blue. And the stranger who has just come to on the frozen road, with no memory, suddenly realizes that a single blow from his hammer could fix all of this. The cold strikes first. Not the wind, not the frost. The cold that creeps under the skin and straight into the bones. Daniel Crow opens his eyes wide. Above him is a low, gray sky. He is sitting on the frozen ground by a broken road and has no idea where he is or how he got here. The last thing he remembers? Headlights in the mirror, the screech of brakes, a crash. After that, nothing. And now he's wearing someone else's clothes, coarse fabric, heavy lace-up boots. Tucked into his belt is his old carpenter's hammer, the very one with his initials burned into the worn handle. Dan pulls it out and turns it over in his hand. It's his hammer. He'd recognize it among 1,000. Nothing else matters. The road vanishes into the fog on both sides. To the right, a bare forest looms dark. To the left, a thin column of smoke rises over the hill. Dan stands up. His knees are shaking, not from fear, but from the cold. No cars, no poles, no wires, only cracked stone underfoot and a silence that rings in his ears. He walks toward the smoke. Smoke means people. People mean answers, or at least a fire. Beyond the hill is not a village, not even a farmstead. A crooked shack with half its roof missing. Liquid gray smoke oozes from a hole in the ceiling. At the entrance, sitting on an overturned bucket, is that same boy. Barefoot, blue lips. On his lap is a younger girl, maybe 5, wrapped in a dirty rag. The boy is whispering something to her, quietly, monotonously, like a nursery rhyme. The girl doesn't move. Dan freezes 3 steps away. The boy looks up at him, and there is no fear in those eyes. It's worse than that. There is patience, the kind found in those who no longer expect help, but simply sit and wait for it all to end. Dan looks at the shack, at the girl, back at the shack. He doesn't know where he is, doesn't know what happened, doesn't know if he's even alive. But he sees the boy with blue lips and his sister who won't move, and a structure he can't bring himself to call a home. He tucks the hammer into his belt and walks around the shack in a circle. Habit drowns out everything else. 15 years on Portland construction sites have done a number on his brain. He can't look at a building without seeing what's wrong with it. The south wall is rotten through and through. Instead of a foundation, there are 2 holes in the ground. The roof hangs on a single beam that's barely holding on itself. The stove is built of stones without mortar. Smoke pours not into the chimney, but through the cracks. Dan places his palm on the wall. And then something happens that he didn't expect. He feels the house. Not with his hand, not with his skin, somewhere deeper. The building speaks to him through his palm. Rot all along the south side. 3 of the 4 beams are dead. The stove is spewing fumes inside. It's a miracle these children are still alive. Dan pulls his hand away. He looks at his palm, at the hammer, at the boy who is silently drilling him with his gaze. He sits down next to him. He asks the boy his sister's name. The boy answers, Lena. Dan nods. He says his name is Dan and that he'll fix their house. The boy doesn't blink. Then he mutters that his name is Theo, and that there's nothing to fix here. Dan winks at him. It's not up to Theo to decide. 10 minutes, maybe 15. He asks Theo to carry Lena away. Theo doesn't move. He doesn't believe a word, but Dan is already getting up and walking toward the cabin. He freezes in front of it. He closes his eyes, and he does what he's done 1,000 times. He builds it in his head. Not a castle, not a palace. A house. A normal, sturdy, warm house. A log cabin he'd built dozens of times in Oregon. Thick logs, a warm entryway. Small windows facing north, large ones facing south, catching the light. A stove in the center. A warm floor above the crawl space. He sees every board, every joint, every corner. He opens his eyes. He pulls out the hammer. The handle fits his palm like a glove, the familiar weight. He walks up to the wall, raises the hammer, and strikes. Once. The sound is strange, not the thud of wood. Something deeper, as if a bell had been struck underground. The cabin shudders. Dan steps back. The walls are moving. They aren't collapsing. They're actually moving. The rotten planks darken and swell. The cracks close up. The roof creeps upward. Logs grow out of the walls like bones setting in a broken arm. 30 seconds, maybe 40. The cabin settles with a quiet creak and rises again. Dan watches. Before him is his house, his project. Dark, resinous logs, a door on hinges, windows. Even steady smoke rises from the chimney. The hammer in his hand is warm. He turns around. Theo stands 5 steps away, holding Lena in his arms. His mouth is open. His eyes are wide. Dan steps inside. He feels the stove with his palm. There's a draft, no fumes. The walls are smooth. The floor is warm. He goes outside. He picks up Lena. She's too light. He carries her inside and lays her on the bench by the stove. He covers her with a burlap sack that is now, for some reason, thicker and cleaner. Lena doesn't wake up, but her face relaxes. For the first time in a long while, she's warm. Theo follows him in. He freezes in the middle of the room. He looks at the walls, at the stove, at his sleeping sister, at the gray light in the window, and he cries, silently, like an adult. He just stands there, tears streaming down his cheeks. Dan sits down on the floor by the stove. He leans his back against the warm wall. The hammer lies on his lap, warm, silent. He doesn't understand what happened. He doesn't understand where he is. He doesn't understand how the hammer did it. But one thing he understands for sure. This boy and his sister will sleep in the warmth tonight. The rest can wait until morning. He tells Theo that everything is fine, that they'll figure it out in the morning. Theo doesn't answer. He just sits down next to him and leans his shoulder against him. A minute later, the boy is asleep. Dan sits in the darkening house. He listens to the fire crackling. He looks at the 2 sleeping children. And he has one thought. It seems he's figured out what he'll be doing here. Dan woke up because he was freezing. The stove had gone out. It was still dark outside, but the sky in the east was turning slightly gray. Theo and Lena were sleeping on the bench. He got up quietly and tossed the remaining firewood he found by the wall into the stove. There wasn't much, enough for one night, maybe 2. He went outside. The air stung his lungs. The frost was so biting that the snow crunched under his boots like glass. Dan looked around. Yesterday in the dark, he had seen only the hut. Now, in the pre-dawn twilight, he saw more. Beyond the hill, down a gentle slope, stood another dozen or so structures, if you could call them that. Huts, dugouts, some sort of shelters made of poles and straw. Paths wound through the snow between them. Smoke rose from 2 or 3 chimneys. The rest were dead, either empty or their inhabitants couldn't afford a fire. A village. Dan stood and counted the houses, 15. Of those, maybe 5 had even a wisp of smoke. The rest were dark. He walked down the path. His boots were the only sound in the whole village. Not even the dogs were barking. He approached the nearest hut. He placed his palm against the wall. The same sensation as yesterday. The building spoke to him through his palm. The walls were thin. The wind blew right through them. The roof was leaking in 3 places. There was no stove at all, just a hole in the floor lined with stones. Smoke escaped through a hole in the ceiling. Someone was breathing inside, heavy and raspy. Dan took his hand away. He walked to the next hut, same story, and the next one, and the next. 15 houses, all sick, all dying, like 15 patients in a ward without a doctor. He returned to Theo and Lena's house. Theo was no longer asleep. He was sitting by the stove, warming his hands. When he saw Dan, he looked up. Dan sat down across from him. He started asking questions. What was the name of the village? Theo said, Helland. How many people are here? Theo thought for a moment and said there used to be 60, now maybe 40. The rest have left or died. Who's in charge here? Theo said the village elder, Garrett. He lives in the big house down the road. Big is a bit of an exaggeration, but it's the biggest in the village. Dan asked where they get firewood. Theo pointed to the forest beyond the road. But the forest is far away. The axes are dull, and there aren't many men left. Half have gone south to look for work. Half of those who stayed are sick. Dan asked about water. Theo said there was a well, but it had frozen over a month ago. They melt snow for water. Dan asked about food. Theo fell silent. Then he said there wasn't much food. Very little. Dan nodded. He stood up and told Theo to look after his sister and keep the stove hot. Then he went down to the biggest house in the village. The house of the village elder, Garrett, turned out to be a log structure the size of a 2-car garage. Dan placed his hand on the wall. Better than the rest, but not by much. The foundation had settled on one corner. The roof was sagging. The stove was built well enough, but the chimney was clogged. He knocked on the door. A man in his 50s, thin, wiry, with eyes red from smoke and a beard with straws stuck in it. He looked at Dan suspiciously, asked who he was. Dan said his name was Dan, that he was a builder, that yesterday he had repaired the house up on the hill. Garrett narrowed his eyes. He'd heard a sound during the night, a strange sound, like a bell. Dan nodded and said it was him, and he suggested Garrett go up and take a look. Garrett threw a fur over his shoulders and followed him. They walked up to Theo and Lena's house. Garrett stopped 10 paces away. He stood and looked. Then he moved closer. He touched the wall. He walked around the house. He peered inside. He came out. He looked at Dan. His face went through 3 expressions: disbelief, then fear, then something else. Something like hope, but cautious. Like a man who'd been burned many times. He asked how Dan had done it. Dan showed him the hammer, said he was a builder, that he had tools, that he could fix houses in the village. Garrett was silent for a long time. Then he asked what Dan wanted in return. Dan didn't understand the question at first. Then he did. Everything here had a price. Every nail, every board, every hour of someone else's labor. He said he needed food and a place by the fire. Garrett looked at him, trying to figure out the catch. He couldn't find one. That scared him even more. But Dan didn't wait for the village elder to make up his mind. He went down to the first house in the village, the one where he'd heard ragged breathing behind the wall that morning. He placed his palm on the wall, closed his eyes, visualized it in his mind. A simple house, not as big as Theo's, 1 room, but with proper walls, with a masonry stove, with a window, with a floor that didn't let the cold through. He raised the hammer. He struck. The same sound, deep, like a bell. The shack shook and began to change. A minute later, a house stood in its place, small but sturdy and warm. The door opened. An old woman stood in the doorway. She was holding onto the doorframe and looking at her house, at her new house, at the walls that weren't drafty, at the stove that was already drawing evenly and strongly. She looked up at Dan, opened her mouth. She closed it. Then she simply bowed to him, low, silently. Dan felt his throat tighten. He nodded to her. He walked to the next house. Behind him, Garrett stood in the middle of the village and watched. By the 3rd house, Dan began to feel tired. Not physically, something else. As if every blow was draining something from him. Energy, strength, something he didn't know the name of. After the 3rd house, he stopped, sat down on a log. His hands were shaking. His head was buzzing. Garrett came over, asked if everything was okay. Dan said he needed to rest, an hour or two, then he'd continue. Garrett nodded. Then he did something Dan didn't expect. He went back to his house and brought out a bowl of porridge, hot, with a piece of stale bread. He set it down in front of Dan on the log. He didn't say a word. He just set it down and left. Dan ate slowly. The porridge was bland and watery. The bread was hard as a rock. It was the best meal of his life. After the break, he repaired another house, the fourth one. The sweat on his forehead turned to sweat. His legs felt like cotton. He realized that was his limit for the day. 4 houses in a day. He wouldn't have the strength for a 5th. He returned to Theo and Lena's house. Lena had woken up. She was sitting by the stove, eating something from a clay bowl. When she saw Dan, she looked up. Big eyes, dark. She didn't say anything. She just clicked her bowl to him. Dan sat down next to her. He took the bowl. It contained the same thin porridge. He looked at Lena, then at Theo, who was standing in the corner. Theo said that Lena wanted Dan to eat because he had repaired their house. Dan ate. Then he returned the bowl to Lena and thanked her. For the first time in a long way, Theo watched and said nothing. That night, Dan lay on the floor by the stove and thought. 4 houses a day. 15 houses in the village. 4 days of work. But the houses are just the beginning. We need a well. We need firewood. We need food. We need a proper bakery oven for the whole village. We need a grain storage shed, if we ever get any grain. He lay there and made a list in his head, just as he did at every site, assessing the scale, priorities, work order. He fell asleep with a hammer in his hand and a list in his head. On the 3rd day, Dan repaired the last house in Helland, the 15th. He sat in the snow by the well and couldn't get up. His hands hung limply at his sides, as if they weren't his own. His vision was blurry. Garrett stood nearby and said nothing. Over the course of 3 days, the village elder had gone from suspicion to quiet respect. He no longer asked what Dan wanted in return. He simply made sure the builder ate 3 meals a day and slept at least 6 hours. Now all 15 houses stood firm. Warm walls, proper stoves, windows that closed, doors that kept the wind out. The village had changed in 3 days, but the problems weren't over. The well was dead. Dan walked up to it on the morning of the 4th day. He placed his palm on the stone wall. The hammer gave him a vision again. The masonry was crooked. 2 stones had cracked from the frost. There was water below, but the shaft was frozen solid, 2 meters deep. The pipe that someone had once tried to run to the neighboring house was clogged with mud and ice. Dan stood by the well for an hour. He thought. He had never built wells. It wasn't his specialty. He knew the principle. He knew what a proper well should look like. But knowing and being able to do are 2 different things. He recalled the feel of the hammer. The hammer built what Dan envisioned in his head. If he envisioned the well incorrectly, the result would be wrong. It could be dangerous. He sat down and began to think like an engineer. Not like a carpenter, but like an engineer. Water intake, depth, casing, insulation of the top so it wouldn't freeze, drainage. He didn't know everything, but he knew enough to envision a simple, functional well with an insulated top and stone casing. Not a masterpiece, but functional. He struck. The well hummed. The stones shifted, aligned, and were covered with new masonry. A wooden canopy with a lid appeared on top. Dan peered inside. The water stood 1.5 feet from the surface, clear, unfrozen. He scooped it up with a bucket, lifted it, tasted it. The water was cold and delicious. Garrett stood nearby. He looked at the water in the bucket, then at Dan. Then his face broke. The village elder, who was over 50 and had carried the dying village on his own shoulders for 3 years. He stood there and cried. He said it had been 3 months. 3 months they had been melting snow. 3 months the children had been sick from dirty water. For 3 months, every morning he'd walk to the well, stand over it, and not know what to do. Dan put his hand on his shoulder. He didn't say anything. He just stood there until Garrett calmed down. Then he asked where they could put a bakery here. Garrett looked at him with teary eyes. He asked again, "A bakery?" Dan nodded. "A baking oven. A big one. For the whole village, so everyone could bake bread together, and the heat from the oven would go into the next room. The latter would be a common hall, where people could gather, eat, talk, warm themselves." Garrett pointed to an empty spot in the center of the village. A barn had once stood there, but it had collapsed 2 years ago. Dan walked over that spot. Under the snow were the remains of the foundation, stones, logs, rubble. He placed his palm on the ground. The hammer showed him what was beneath, the remains of a stone foundation, an old one, maybe 50 years old, maybe older, but sturdy, workable. Dan closed his eyes and began to build in his mind. It was more complicated than a house, much more complicated. A bakery isn't just walls and a roof. It's an oven with proper draft. It's ventilation so the heat doesn't kill those who work there. It's a storage room next door. It's work surfaces. He built it in his head for 20 minutes. He changed things around, rearranged them, removed the unnecessary, added what was needed. Then he opened his eyes. He raised the hammer and struck. Not once, 3 times. The first blow raised the walls. The second blow put up the roof and the oven. The third blow finished the details. Doors, windows, shelves, benches along the walls, a table in the center of the hall. After the third blow, Dan fell to his knees. The world was spinning. His mouth was dry. His hands were shaking so hard that he dropped the hammer into the snow. Garrett ran over. He picked it up. 2 men from the village took Dan by the arms and led him inside the new building. They laid him on a bench. Someone brought water. Someone covered him with a hide. Dan lay there, breathing. The ceiling drifted above him, slowly, like a river. He lay there for 2 hours. Then he sat up. His head was still spinning, but his hands weren't shaking anymore. He looked around the bakery. The oven was a good one. He knew that because he built ones like it, not in bakeries, but in homes. But the principle was the same. A large firebox, the right arch so the heat would spread evenly, a chimney with a damper. Next to it was a hall with a long table and benches, warm, dry, bright. Garrett stood in the middle of the hall and touched the walls, like a blind man trying to believe what he sees. By evening on the 4th day, the whole village had gathered in the new hall. 40 people. Old men, women, children, a few men. They sat at the table and ate. Someone had found some flour and baked the first loaf of bread in the new oven. Crooked, flat, not quite done, but hot. Dan sat in the corner and watched. Theo and Lena sat next to him. Lena chewed the bread and looked at the people around her. Theo was silent. Then he turned to Dan and asked quietly. He asked where Dan had come from. Dan thought for a moment. Then he said, "From far away. Very far away." Theo asked why he was here. Dan looked at the room full of people, at the hot bread, at the oven that was giving off heat, at the faces that, for the first time in a long while, were not gray, but alive. He said it was for work. Theo didn't smile, but his eyes softened slightly. At night, Dan went out into the street. The village was asleep. Smoke rose from every chimney, steady, even. Snow lay on the new roofs in a thin, even layer. It was quiet. It was cold. It was good. Dan stood in the middle of the village and thought about what would happen next. 15 houses, a well, a bakery. That was one village. And how many such villages were there in this north? 10? 50? 100? He couldn't fix them all. He understood that. 4 houses a day. Then he collapsed. 3 blows to the bakery, and he lay flat on his back for 2 hours. His body wasn't infinite. His strength wasn't infinite. He had to come up with something else. He stood in the cold and thought. And for the first time in 4 days in this world, he wasn't thinking about the next building, but about the system, about how to make it so people could build on their own, without him, without a hammer, simply because someone would show them how. On the 5th day, a woman came to the village. Dan saw her in the morning when he went out to check on the bakery. She was standing by the road with a worn-out tube bag slung over her shoulder, looking at the village. Short, thin, short black hair peeking out from under a hood, a face windswept. Her eyes were calm and attentive. She looked at Helen the way a person looks at something impossible. Dan walked up to her. He asked if she was lost. She replied that she wasn't. She had been walking along the northern road and saw smoke, a lot of smoke, from 15 chimneys. She said that for the past 2 months, the villages along this road hadn't been smoking. They stood dead, frozen, empty. And here were 15 chimneys and the smell of bread. She said she couldn't believe her eyes and decided to come closer. Her name was Sora Khan. She was a cartographer, or a former cartographer's apprentice, or both. Dan invited her into the bakery and gave her some bread. Sora ate silently and quickly. It was clear she hadn't eaten properly in a long time. While she ate, Dan looked at the maps sticking out of her case. Rolled up sheets, yellowed edges, ink drawings. He asked what she was looking for up north. Sora stopped eating. She looked at him. Then she said she was looking for her brother. He had left 5 years ago with a trade caravan, headed north. The caravan never returned. She had been following his trail ever since, checking villages. She asks people. She draws maps of the places she's been. Dan asked if she had found anything. Sora shook her head. Dan was silent for a moment. Then he asked if she knew these parts. Sora nodded. She knew the northern duchy of Moorlander better than anyone alive, because she had walked its length from end to end, 3 times. Dan asked her to show him the map. Sora unfolded one of the sheets on the table. Dan leaned over it. The map was beautiful, accurate, detailed. Roads, rivers, villages, towns, ruins. Everything was drawn with a thin, precise line. But some villages were crossed out with an X. Dan asked what the X's meant. Sora said they were dead villages, the ones where no one was left. There were many of them. Dan counted the crosses. 17. 17 dead villages just on this section of the map. He leaned back, looked at Sora. She was looking at him, calmly, without hope, without a plea. She just looked. She asked what he was doing in Helland, how he had repaired all the houses, who he was. Dan thought. Then he told the truth. Not all of it, but enough. He said he was a builder, that he had a tool that allowed him to repair buildings quickly, that he had arrived here recently and didn't know this world. He didn't know its rules. He didn't know its history. He didn't know who ruled these lands or who was fighting whom here. Sora listened without interrupting. Then she nodded. She said that explained why he spoke strangely. Dan smiled and asked, how strange? Sora said that half his words were unfamiliar to her, but she got the gist. Dan asked if she could explain to him what he didn't understand, to tell him where he was, what was happening here, who these people were, and why they were freezing. Sora looked at him for a long time. Then she said she could, if he'd let her go with him. Dan asked where. Sora pointed to the map, to the next village to the north, an 8-hour walk. She said people lived there too, or had lived there a week ago when she passed by. Dan looked at the map, at the crosses, at the villages that hadn't been crossed out yet. He nodded. That day, Sora began to tell her story. She told him about Arcadion, about the fall of the towers, about the builders who left 500 years ago and took the magic of construction with them, about how stone had become a rarity, about how carpenters were valued as highly as silver, about the snowy years that had been killing the North for the third year in a row. Dan listened. He asked questions. Lots of questions. Sora answered patiently. She spoke sparingly and precisely, every word to the point, no beating around the bush. Dan appreciated that. He was like that himself. By evening, he knew enough to grasp the scale of the problem. The Duchy of Moorlander occupied the entire northern part of the continent. Dozens of villages, several towns, and they were all freezing. Slowly, year after year, because the houses didn't hold the heat, because no one knew how to build, because those who did were so expensive that a village couldn't even afford to repair a well. Dan lay in Theo's house at night, staring at the ceiling. Sora had settled into the bakery. Garrett had given her a spot by the oven. The hammer lay next to Dan, warm, quiet. Dan thought. He thought about the 17 crosses on the map, about the villages he hadn't managed to save because he didn't know about them, about the people who were freezing right now while he lay in a warm house. He couldn't fix the whole North, he knew that, but he could go from village to village, fix what could be fixed, and teach people what he knew, so that the next house they built, they would build it themselves. In the morning, he went out to Garrett, said he was leaving, that he was heading north, that the village was now in order and would last through the winter. Garrett looked at him. Then he nodded. He didn't ask him to stay. He understood. But before leaving, he took Dan to the barn. Inside stood a workbench, old, cracked. Tools lay on the workbench, an axe, a saw, a plane, all blunt, all rusty, but all real. Garrett said that was all they had, but if Dan showed any of the men how to build, they'd learn something. Dan looked at the tools, then at Garrett. Then he said he wouldn't leave today. He'd leave in 3 days, and for those 3 days, he'd teach. He gathered 5 men from the village, those who could hold an axe, and he began to teach. Not magic, not how to use a hammer, just basic carpentry, how to cut a corner, how to set rafters, how to build a stone stove with clay mortar so it wouldn't smoke or poison them with carbon monoxide, how to insulate walls with moss and clay, simple things, basic, the things he'd learned in his first year on a construction site when he was 19. The men listened. Some caught on quickly, others slowly. One guy in his 20s named Bren picked everything up on the fly. His hands were nimble, his eye was precise. Dan would demonstrate once and Bren would repeat it, not perfectly, but correctly. 3 days later, there was one person in the village who understood the basics. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. On the morning of the 8th day, Dan got ready. A hammer tucked into his belt, nothing else. Sora was waiting by the road with a tube slung over her shoulder. Theo stood by his house and watched. Lena ran out and hugged Dan's leg. He crouched down. He patted her on the head. He said he'd be back. Lena looked him in the eyes and told him to promise. Dan paused. Then he promised. He stood and walked north along the road. Sora walked beside him, silently. Half an hour later, the village disappeared behind a hill. A road lay ahead, rutted, empty. On both sides, a white field stretched to the horizon. Sora unfolded the map as they walked. She pointed to a spot, the next village, Grunden, an 8-hour walk. Dan nodded. They set off. Grunden turned out to be worse than Helland. They arrived at sunset, 8 hours along a broken road in the freezing cold. Sora walked steadily. Didn't complain, didn't stop. Once she pointed to a side trail and said it led to a dead village she'd marked with a cross on the map 2 months ago. Dan didn't turn off. The living are more important. Grundon stood in a hollow between two hills, a bad place to settle. The wind blew from both sides. Snow had piled up on the roofs. Dan saw 9 houses. No, 8 houses, and something that had once been the 9th. Of the 8, only 2 had smoke coming from them. There were people here, but not many. They entered the village, and the first person they met was a man standing by a crooked fence, tall, skinny, with empty eyes. He looked at them and didn't move. Sora called out to him. He turned his head, slowly, as if he'd forgotten that people could move. He asked what they wanted. Sora said they were heading north and looking for a place to stay the night. The man looked at her, then at Dan. Then he said there was no place to stay, that there was no food, that there was nothing here at all, and that they should keep going. Dan didn't keep going. He walked up to the nearest house. He placed his hand on the wall. The scene was familiar. Rot, cracks. The roof was barely holding on. The stove was smoking inside. But there was something worse here. The foundation. The houses stood in a low-lying area, and the groundwater was rising. The walls were drawing moisture from below. The rot wasn't from age, but from water. Dan took his hand away. This changed the task. He couldn't just fix the houses like he had in Helland. He had to solve the water problem first. Drainage, water diversion, raise the foundation. He stood there thinking. Sora stood nearby, waiting. The man by the fence was standing there watching too. Dan asked him who was in charge here. The man said there was no one in charge. There had been a village head, but he'd left for the south with his family a month ago. He'd taken what he could and left. Those who had nowhere else to go remained. 19 people. Dan nodded. He asked them to gather everyone. The man looked at him as if he were crazy. But something in Dan's face made him turn away silently and go from house to house. Half an hour later, 19 people stood before Dan. Old people, women, few children, 2 men capable of working. They stood in the snow and looked at him with the same expression as the man by the fence. Emptiness, weariness, the indifference of people who no longer cared. Dan said he was a builder, that he had come from the south, that he could repair their homes. No one reacted. One woman laughed, briefly and bitterly. She said they'd already been promised help. A month ago, a man from the city had come. He said they'd send carpenters, that they'd help, that they wouldn't forget. No one came. Dan listened. He nodded. Then he walked over to her house, the most dilapidated of them all. He placed his hand on the wall. He examined it. He thought. A different approach was needed here. You can't just knock it down and fix it. Drainage first. He walked around the house, found the spot where water pooled the most, by the back wall. The snow here wasn't white, but gray, damp. The ground beneath it squelched. Dan thought for 5 minutes, then 10. He recalled everything he knew about drainage. Ditches, slope, a gravel bed, drain pipes. He couldn't build a full-fledged drainage system with a single blow. That was beyond his confident knowledge. But he could raise the foundation. Add a stone bed under the house. Make the walls out of a material that doesn't absorb water. And dig a simple ditch from the house to the nearest slope. He didn't make the ditch with a hammer. He dug the ditch with his hands, with a shovel he found at one of the houses. Sora watched him in surprise. Then she asked why he was digging when he had a hammer. Dan explained. The hammer builds what he knows. He isn't 100% sure about the drainage. If he makes a mistake, the hammer will build a beautiful house on a rotten foundation. In a year, the house will collapse. Or worse. That's why, whatever he isn't sure about, he does with his hands. With his hands, he can make a mistake and fix it. The hammer makes a mistake only once. Sora was silent. Then she took the second shovel and started digging next to him. They dug for 2 hours. The trench turned out shallow, 1 meter deep, 20 meters from the house to the hillside. But the water started flowing, slowly, a thin trickle, but it flowed. Dan returned to the house. Now he was ready. He closed his eyes. He pictured it in his mind. a house on a high stone foundation, half a meter off the ground, double-sheaved walls, an air gap between the inner and outer walls. He knew that for sure. He'd done it dozens of times in Oregon, where it rained 9 months a year. He raised the hammer. He struck. The house changed. It rose. The walls darkened and swelled. The roof straightened. The stone foundation grew out of the ground and lifted the entire house half a meter. Steps appeared at the door. Dan went inside. He checked. The walls were dry. The floor was warm. The stove was drawing. The air was clean. He went outside. The woman who had been laughing was standing in front of her house. She didn't recognize him. She touched the wall. She climbed the steps. She opened the door. She closed it. She opened it again. Then she turned to Dan. She didn't say anything. She just stood there and looked at him. And there was no longer emptiness in her eyes. There was something new there. Something alive. Dan repaired 2 more houses that day. He dug a trench in front of each one, with his hands. One of the village men helped him with the second trench. He approached silently, took a shovel, started digging. Dan showed him the slope and depth. The man nodded and worked. By nightfall, 3 of the 8 houses were ready. Dan could barely stand. 3 hammer blows plus 3 trenches with a shovel. His body ached from the usual physical labor, and his head buzzed from the magical work. Sora sat him down by the stove in the new house. She brought water. Dan drank and thought. Here, the task was different. In Helland, it was enough to repair the houses. In Grunden, he had to solve the water problem first, and only then build. Every village would be different. Each would have its own ailment, its own reason for dying, and he wouldn't be able to treat them all with the same remedy. On the morning of the 5th day in Grunden, he got up and went to the 4th house, to dig a trench. But 3 people were already standing by the house: the man who had helped yesterday, the woman from the repaired house, and a boy of about 14. They had shovels. They were already digging. Dan stopped. He watched them. The man looked up and asked if the slope was right. Dan walked over. He looked. He said no. He showed them where to dig. The man nodded and continued. Dan stood and watched as 3 people who had been dead inside yesterday were now digging a trench for their neighbor today. He didn't smile. He wasn't moved. He just thought, this is it. This is what's more important than the hammer. He showed them once. They did it themselves. A week later, he finished Grunden. 8 houses, 8 ditches. The residents dug half the ditches. Dan swung the hammer. They dug together. He didn't fix the last house with a hammer. He gathered 4 residents who by then already understood what a slope, drainage, and a foundation were, and together, with their own hands, they lifted the last house. No magic. Slowly. Crooked. Not perfect. But they did it themselves. The house wasn't as sturdy as the ones Dan had repaired. The walls were slightly crooked. The stove smoked more than it should have. But the house stood, and the people who had built it stood nearby and looked at it. And that was better than any blow of a hammer. Before leaving, the man by the fence, the very first one with the empty eyes, approached Dan. He said his name was Torin. He said thank you, and he asked if anyone else would come, or just him. Dan said he didn't know, but he said that now Torin knew how to dig drainage and how to lay a foundation above ground, and that this knowledge wouldn't go anywhere. Torin looked at him. Then he nodded. Dan and Sora stepped out onto the road. Ahead lay the next point on the map. The 3rd village was called Kolmar. It took them 2 days to reach it. The road got worse by the hour. The stones were broken. The ruts were filled with ice. In one spot, the road simply ended. A 3-meter-wide gully. A spring stream had washed away a section of the road, and no one had repaired it. Dan and Sora walked around the edge. Sora walked in silence. She rarely spoke at all, only when Dan asked her a question. But on the 2nd day, she spoke up on her own. She said that a woman lived in Kolmar who had known her brother, the person to have seen him alive. Dan looked at her. Sora was looking straight ahead. Her face was calm. Her voice was steady. but her fingers on the tube's strap had turned white. Dan said nothing. He just walked a little faster. Colmar turned out to be larger than the two previous villages. 26 houses, a palisade all around, even something like a gate. But the gate hung on a single hinge, and the palisade had collapsed in 3 places. They were met with suspicion. A man stood at the gate with an axe. Not a battle axe, just an ordinary wood-chopping axe, but he held it as if he were ready to swing it. Sora raised her hands. She identified herself. She said she had been here 6 months ago. The man recognized her. He lowered the axe. He let them through. Inside, there were more people than in Helland and Grunden combined. About 70, maybe 80, but the faces were the same. Gray, tired, hungry. Dan walked around the village in an hour. He placed his hand on every wall. The picture was mixed. Some of the houses weren't in such bad shape. Sturdy logs, decent roofs. You could tell that people who knew how to build had once lived here. But the rest were in the same condition as Helland. Rot, cracks, stoves with no draft. 26 houses. 10 of them needed urgent help. Another 10 could be patched up. 6 were in decent shape. Dan counted in his head. 10 houses with a hammer meant 3 days of work, plus a day of rest afterward. 4 days minimum. But that was if he just hammered away. And he had already realized in Grunden that just hammering away wasn't enough. You had to look, think, find the cause. Here, the cause was something else. Not water, not the cold. People. Or rather, their absence. Colmar had once been a large village, 40 houses, but 14 of them stood empty. The residents had gone south. Those who remained couldn't support the whole village. There weren't enough hands, there weren't enough skills. The blacksmith had died 2 years ago, and since then, no one had been able to repair the tools. The saws were dull, the axes were chipped. There were no nails at all. Dan stood in the middle of the village and thought. He could repair the houses with a hammer, but you can't repair tools with a hammer. The hammer worked on structures, not on individual objects. He had tried it back in Helland. He placed his palm on a dull axe and felt nothing. The hammer was silent. Only buildings, only walls, only what could be called a structure. He started with the worst houses. The first day, 4 strikes. By evening, he was lying in one of the repaired houses, drinking hot water. Not even tea, just hot water. Sora sat nearby and drew. She was drawing a map of Colmar, an accurate one, with every house, with marks indicating which ones were repaired and which weren't. Dan watched her work. Then he said she needed to find that woman. Sora froze. She looked at him. Dan said they were here for a few days. There was enough time. Let it go and ask around. He'll manage on his own. Sora was silent for a long time. Then she rolled up the map. She stood up and left. She returned 3 hours later. Dan was already asleep. In the morning, he found her by the extinguished fire in the square. She was sitting motionless. The tube lay nearby. Her eyes were red. Dan sat down beside her. He didn't ask. He waited. Sora spoke up on her own. The woman had told her. Her brother's wagon train had reached Greyhorn Pass, further north. A storm had caught them there. The horses had frozen to death. The people tried to take shelter in the ruins of an old fort, but the fort was in such a state that the roof collapsed on the 3rd day. Of the 12 people, 4 survived. Sora's brother wasn't among them. Sora spoke calmly, without tears, without a tremor in her voice, as if she were retelling someone else's story. But her hands lay on her knees, and her fingers were clenched so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Dan was silent. Then he said one thing. He said that when they reached Greyhorn Pass, he would repair that fort, so that the next wagon train, caught in a storm, would find a roof over its head. Sora turned her head, looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded. They didn't discuss it further. Dan went back to work. The 2nd day, 4 more houses. The 3rd day, 2 houses and a stockade. The stockade took 2 swings. He pictured it as a fence, a long, sturdy fence made of thick logs. It was simple. He'd built fences hundreds of times. On the fourth day, he set about the thing that had been weighing on his mind: the tools. The hammer couldn't fix them. But Dan could teach people to make do with what they had. He gathered the men and women of the village. 12 people came. The rest were too sick or too skeptical. Dan showed them things that didn't require good tools.
How to make wooden dowels instead of nails. How to sharpen an axe on a wet stone. How to make a saw from a strip of metal, if you can find a strip of metal. How to caulk cracks with moss and resin. How to build a stove from river stones with clay mortar. People listened. Some tried. One woman named Mira turned out to be surprisingly skilled. Strong hands, a keen eye. She made dowels faster than some of the men. Dan noticed this. He called her over separately, showed her how to make a simple joint, tongue and groove. Mira tried. She got it on the third try. Dan told her she had the hands of a carpenter. Mira looked at him strangely. She said she was a woman. Dan didn't understand what that had to do with it. Then he understood. A different world, different rules. He said that to a tree, it doesn't matter who cuts it, man or woman. What matters to a tree is that the hands are steady. Mira looked at him. Then she smiled. It was the first time he'd seen a smile in Colmar. On the fifth day, before leaving, Dan did one more thing. In the center of the village stood an old bell on a pole. The pole had rotted, and the bell had been lying in the snow for a year. No one had picked it up. Dan lifted the pole with a single blow of his hammer. He imagined it as part of a structure. A pole with a canopy. A tiny structure, but enough for the hammer to work. The pole stood. The bell was hung. Garrett in Helland, Torin in Grundeam, Mira in Colmar. 3 villages. 3 people who remained, and who knew a little more than they did yesterday. Dan and Sora walked out onto the road. Sora walked in silence. But something in her had changed after that conversation. She didn't walk the way she used to. Before, she walked forward, toward her brother, into the void. Now she walked beside Dan, toward the next village, toward something alive. A month had passed, 4 villages behind them. Colmar, then Weston, then Darkmoor. Then a small hamlet of 6 houses that didn't even have a name. Dan kept count. 47 houses repaired with a hammer, 12 ditches dug by hand, 3 wells restored, 1 bakery, 2 livestock sheds, and 14 people who now knew at least the basics: how to cut a corner, how to set rafters, how not to poison a family with carbon monoxide from a crooked stove. Sora kept track on a map. Every village, every house, every person Dan had taught. She drew symbols. A hammer meant a repaired house. A hand meant a house built by people without a hammer. There weren't many hands yet, but they were there. By the end of the 5th week, they reached Calden. It was no longer a village, a town. Small by the standards of the world Dan still remembered, but by Arcadion's standards, it was something. Stone walls, gates, a tower at the entrance, a market, 3 streets, nearly 200 houses, maybe 1,000 people. Sora said that Calden was the county seat of the Duchy of Moorlander. The county administrator was based here. There was a garrison here, a small one, 20 soldiers. There's a market square here. And there are problems here. Dan saw them even as he approached. The city walls were made of stone. That's good. But the stone was old, very old. The masonry was cracking. The wall had sagged in 3 places. One tower was propped up with wooden logs. The gates didn't close all the way. It wasn't any better inside. The main street was paved with stone, but the stones had shifted apart, and frozen mud stood between them. The houses along the street were better than those in the villages, but not by much. Stone first floors, wooden second floors, rotten wood, leaky roofs. Dan placed his palm on the first wall, and the hammer showed him the city. Sick, old, tired.
like a man who is still standing but is already falling apart inside. They were stopped at the gate. A soldier asked who they were and why they were there. Sora showed her cartographer's papers. They were let through. But the soldier looked at the hammer on Dan's belt and frowned. Inside the city, Dan immediately noticed the difference. Here were people of varying means. Merchants with carts stood by the market. People in fine clothes walked down the main street. But as soon as they turned onto a side, the scene changed. Mud, crowded streets, houses pressed up against one another, barefoot children, old people leaning against walls, the stench of sewage. Two cities in one. Dan had seen this in Portland. Rich neighborhoods and poor neighborhoods just a street apart. But here the difference was sharper. Here the poor neighborhoods were deadly, literally. Sora led him to an inn, small, dirty, but with hot food. They sat in a corner. Dan ate and thought. 200 houses. He couldn't fix 200 houses. He physically couldn't. Even if he fixed 4 a day without a break, that's 50 days, almost 2 months. And after every day, he'd be flat on his back. No, a different approach was needed here. He needed people. Not just Bren and not just Mira. He needed a crew, a real one. Like on the construction site in Portland. A foreman and 10 pairs of hands. A hammer for what can't be done by hand. Hands for everything else. He told this to Sora. Sora nodded and said that people could be found, but they needed permission from the county administrator. Without it, you can't get anything done in the city. In the morning, they went to see the administrator. His name was Lord Brett Cassidy. Short, heavy-set, with a red face and small, intelligent eyes. He received them in a hall that had once been beautiful. Carved stone walls, a fireplace, tapestries. But the carvings were cracked. The fireplace was smoking. The tapestries hung crookedly because the wall behind them had sagged. Dan placed his hand on the wall while waiting in the hallway. The building was sick. The foundation had sagged on the east side. A load-bearing wall had cracked. The fireplace was built incorrectly, and the draft was pulling inward instead of outward. Lord Cassidy listened to them. Sora spoke. Dan was silent and watched. Cassidy wasn't stupid. He asked the right questions. How many houses could Dan repair? How quickly? What would he need in return? Dan answered. He said he could repair 4 houses a day, that he needed people, 10 people to work with him. He would teach them. In a month, they would be able to build on their own, without him. Cassidy listened. Then he asked the main question. He asked what Dan wanted. Gold, land, a title. Dan said he needed people and food for them, and tools, proper tools, axes, saws, hammers, nails. Cassidy leaned back in his chair. He looked at Dan for a long time. Then he said he'd show him something. They left the building and walked through the city. Cassidy led them to the south wall, the one that had sagged the most. He pointed to a crack that ran from the base to the top. He said that this wall held up the town. If it collapsed, the southern quarter would be left unprotected. In winter, the wind from the south would kill the people in those houses within a week. He said he'd been asking the Duke to send masons for 3 years. The Duke had promised. The masons never came. Because the masons in the capital were busy. Because the capital was more important than the county. Because it had always been that way. Dan stood in front of the wall and looked at the crack. He placed his palm on it. The hammer showed. The wall was thick, stone, old. It was 200 years old. The masonry was good. The master who built it knew what he was doing. But time and frost had taken their toll. The foundation beneath the wall had settled in one spot. The crack started there. If it wasn't repaired, the wall would collapse in a year or 2. Dan assessed the scope of the work. The wall was long. The damaged section alone was about 150 meters, 4 meters high, 1 meter thick. It was 10 times bigger than anything he'd done so far. He told Cassidy he could fix it, but not in a day, or 2. He needed a week, and after that, he'd be out of commission for a few days. Cassidy asked what he needed. Dan said he needed those 10 people he'd mentioned, and a week's time, and plenty of food because he'd be eating like a horse. Cassidy nodded. The next morning, 10 people were standing by the south wall, men and women, young and not so young. Cassidy had sent whoever he could, not the best. He couldn't pull the best ones away from other tasks, but strong enough to hold a shovel and listen. Dan looked at them. They looked at him. He said his name was Dan, that he was a builder, that he was going to fix this wall, and that they would help him, and that by the end of the week, they would know more about walls than they had known their whole lives. One man smirked, skeptically. Dan didn't pay any attention. He got to work. For the first 2 days, he didn't touch a hammer. He worked with his hands, together with 10 people. They cleared the base of the wall, cleared away the debris, dug down to the foundation. Dan pointed and explained as they went. Here's the foundation. Here's where it's settled. See how the stones have shifted? That's where the crack started. The men watched and listened. A skeptic named Wallace stopped smirking by the end of the first day. He saw with his own eyes what Dan was talking about. The crack in the foundation, the shifting stones, the logic of the collapse. It made sense. It was obvious. It's just that no one had explained it before. On the third day, Dan started striking with a hammer, section by section, 10 meters of wall at a time. A blow. The stones settled into place. The crack closed. The foundation beneath the section rose and settled into place. After 3 blows, Dan sat down on the ground. His head was buzzing. 30 meters done. 120 left. The fourth day. 3 more blows, another 30 meters. After the third blow, Dan didn't sit down. He collapsed. Sora ran over. She gave him water. He lay on the ground and stared at the sky. Gray, low, eternal. On the 5th day, he could only manage 2 strikes, 20 meters. On the 6th, 2 more. On the 7th, the last 3. 15 strikes in a week. 150 meters of wall. Dan lay in a room at the inn and couldn't lift his arm. Sora sat beside him. She was silent. He lay there for 3 days. For 3 days, he couldn't get up, couldn't hold a spoon, couldn't walk without help. On the 4th day, he got up, went outside, walked to the south wall. The wall stood, smooth, intact. There were no cracks. The foundation hadn't settled. The wall would stand for another 200 years. Wallace stood by the wall. He touched the stones. Dan approached. Wallace turned to him. His face was different. Not skeptical, not empty, alive. He said he wanted to keep learning. Dan nodded. Dan stayed in Calden for a month. Not because he wanted to, because he had to. The wall was just the beginning. After that, Cassidy took him to the market. The roof over the market stalls had collapsed 2 years ago. The merchants stood out in the open. In winter, that meant half the goods were ruined by the snow and half the merchants were sick. Dan repaired the market roof in 2 strikes. Then Cassidy took him to the bridge over the stream on the eastern outskirts. The bridge was wooden and held together by a promise. Beneath it ran the only road to the 3 villages to the east. If the bridge collapsed, the villages would be cut off. Dan repaired the bridge in a single blow. But every day between hammer blows, he worked with the crew. 10 men became 12, then 15. Wallace turned out to be more than just a skeptic who had changed his mind. He had the hands of a stonemason, heavy, precise. He felt stone the same way Dan felt wood. Dan showed him everything he knew about masonry. It wasn't much. Dan was a carpenter, not a mason, but he knew the basics: mortar, jointing, load distribution. Wallace picked it up and added his own touch. He had experience. For 20 years, he'd worked as an assistant to the guild's masons. He knew a lot. But he was never allowed to build on his own. The guild wouldn't let him. Not a guild member. No rights. Dan listened to his story and clenched his teeth. He knew that system. Not here. There. In Portland.
Unions, licenses, bureaucracy. A man knows how to work, but they won't let him because he doesn't have a piece of paper. It was the same here, only instead of a piece of paper, it was the guild badge. And it was that very month that Evelyn Ashmore arrived in Calden. Dan was on the construction site when Sora brought her in. Tall, straight back, dark hair pulled back, expensive but worn clothes, like a suit you wear every day because you don't have a second one.
A beautiful, cold face. Gray eyes. She looked at Dan the way you look at a horse you're about to buy. Appraisingly. Dan noticed this. He didn't like it. Evelyn introduced herself. The daughter of Baron Ashmore. Estates in the southwestern part of the duchy. A castle. Lands. Villages. It all sounded impressive, but Sora later quietly explained to Dan. Baron Ashmore is poor. The castle is falling apart. The lands bring in no income. The villages are emptying out. Evelyn is his only daughter and his only hope. Her father sent her to find a builder. Any builder. At any cost. Because the castle won't survive the coming winter. Evelyn spoke plainly. No tricks. She said she'd heard of a man who repairs houses with a single blow. That she'd been following that rumor for 2 weeks. That she'd found him. And that she was offering him a job. Dan asked what kind. Evelyn said her father was sick, that the castle was cold, that the stoves weren't working, that the walls were freezing through, that if he fixed the castle, she would pay, whatever she could. Dan looked at her. Then he asked how many people lived in the castle. Evelyn said 12. Her father, her, 3 servants, 7 people from the village who lived in the castle because their homes had fallen apart. Dan asked what was wrong with the village. Evelyn paused. Then she said, the village was in bad shape too. Dan said he'd go, but first he'd finish up here. Evelyn frowned. She said her father was unwell, that time was running out. Dan looked at her calmly. He said he understood, but that people here were suffering too, and that he'd finish what he'd started, in a week. Evelyn pressed her lips together. She wasn't used to being turned down, not even partially. But she didn't argue. She stayed in Calden. She waited. And while she waited, she watched. She saw how Dan worked, not with a hammer, with his hands, how he knelt in the mud and showed Wallace how to lay a stone, how he hauled logs alongside the crew, how he ate the same food at the same table with them, how he knew everyone by name. Evelyn was used to a different kind of foreman, the kind who comes, takes the money, does the work, and leaves. Or the kind who comes, the money, and don't do the work. Dan was neither one nor the other. A week later, Dan finished up in Calden. He left Wallace in charge of the crew. He gave him a list of jobs for the month. 20 houses in a poor neighborhood. Not with a hammer, with their hands, using the methods he had taught them. Wallace took the list. He looked at Dan, nodded, said he could handle it. Dan believed him. They set out for the Ashmore estate. Dan, Sora, Evelyn, on the 2 horses Cassidy had given them. They rode for 2 days. Evelyn rode ahead, straight, silent. Sora rode beside Dan and quietly explained things to him. What a baron is in this world. What the Ashmore surname means. What it means when a baron's daughter rides out to find a builder herself instead of sending a messenger. It means there's nothing to send the messenger on. And there's no money for a messenger. Ashmore Castle stood on a hill. From a distance, it looked imposing. Stone walls, 2 towers, a gate. Up close, the picture changed. The stone was crumbling. 1 tower was leaning. The gates wouldn't close. The courtyard was overgrown. The stable by the wall had tilted so that the horses stood in a half-ruined pen, shivering from the cold. Dan dismounted. He approached the castle. He placed his hand on the wall. The hammer showed him everything. And the picture was grim. The foundation had settled on both sides. The load-bearing wall of the south wing was cracked from the base to the roof. All 4 fireplaces were built incorrectly and were smoking inside. The roof was leaking in 10 places. The staircase to the 2nd floor was rotten. The stable stood on rotten stilts and could collapse at any moment. Evelyn stood nearby. She looked at him. She waited.
Dan turned to her.
He didn't mention the castle. He said he would start with the stable. Evelyn blinked. She asked again. Dan said her horses were freezing, that the stable might collapse tonight, that horses were transportation, and without them, the castle was cut off from the world. The stable first, then the stoves, then the walls, then everything else. Evelyn opened her mouth, closed it. She had expected him to start with the throne room, or the main gate, or the tower, something important, but he started with the stable. Dan walked up to the stable, closed his eyes, imagined. Not a castle stable from a movie, an ordinary one, sturdy, warm, stalls for 6 horses, a roof without holes, walls without cracks, feed troughs, water troughs, bedding. He struck. The stable straightened up, darkened, the walls closed in, the roof settled evenly. The horses inside raised their heads and stopped trembling. One tap, a light sheen of sweat. Dan went inside, checked. Everything was in place. He came out, looked at Evelyn. She was standing there, looking at the stable, then at Dan, then back at the stable. She was silent. Then she said quietly that the horses were named Ashes and Night, and that Night had been coughing for the past 2 weeks from the cold. Dan nodded. He said it wouldn't happen again. Then he went to the castle, to the furnaces. Dan worked on Ashmore Castle for 4 days. On the first day, he went through all 4 stoves. They were old-style stone stoves, big, heavy, built by people who knew what they were doing. But time had killed the draft. The chimneys were clogged. The dampers were rusted shut. The joints had cracked. Dan didn't try to fix them with a hammer. The furnaces were part of the castle, and the castle was too big to strike at random. He was afraid that a single blow to the castle would bring the whole building down. And he didn't know anything about castles. He hadn't built castles. He didn't understand their logic. Thick walls, loopholes, spiral staircases. That wasn't his territory. One wrong blow and the castle would stand beautiful on the outside and dead on the inside. The load-bearing walls would give way. The staircase would collapse. Someone would die. He explained this to Evelyn. She listened in silence. Then she asked what he was going to do. Dan said he would work in sections. Not the whole castle at once, but section by section. He would treat each section separately. He would check each one. The ovens first. He struck each oven separately, 4 strikes a day. Each time he closed his eyes and visualized a single stove, a simple one, a stone one, with proper draft, with a clean chimney, with a working damper. The first strike, the stove in the main hall. The stones settled, the chimney cleared, the draft started. Dan checked with his hand, clean, right. The second strike, the stove in the kitchen, same thing. The third, the stove in the servants' quarters. Fourth, the stove in the Baron's bedroom. He tended to this one with particular care. Baron Ashmore lay in bed, old, thin, pale. He coughed constantly, a wet, raspy cough that came from deep within his lungs. The room was cold. The stove was smoking. The window was covered with a hide, but the cold still seeped in. Dan stood by the stove and planned it out in his head. Not just any stove, a stove for a sick man, with high heat output, with slow, even heat, with a draft that would draw the dampness out of the room. He remembered building a fireplace for his colleague's mother in Portland, an old woman with bad lungs. The doctor said she needed dry, warm air. Dan had built a fireplace with a system of air ducts that warmed the air before it entered the room. A simple design, but effective. He pictured it. He struck the stove. It changed. It grew larger. The stones settled more tightly. The chimney straightened, and the room grew warmer. Not right away, but after 10 minutes, Dan felt the difference. The air became dry, warm, just right. Baron Ashmore opened his eyes. He looked at Dan, then at the stove. Then he coughed. But this cough was different, lighter, shorter. He asked in a hoarse voice who this man was. Evelyn was standing in the doorway. She said it was Master Dan, that he had fixed the stove. The Baron looked at his daughter, then at Dan again, then at the stove, which was heating evenly and strongly, and he said quietly that for the first time in 6 months, he felt warm. Evelyn stood in the doorway and didn't move. Dan saw her face. It was stony, as always, but her chin was trembling. He left in silence, left them alone. On the second day, he set to work on the roof. He understood roofs, rafters, lathing, roofing. That was his thing. He divided the castle's roof into sections. He struck each one separately, 6 blows, 6 sections. By evening, the castle's roof was intact, not a single hole, not a single leak. After the 6th blow, Dan sat on the courtyard steps, breathing heavily. His hands were shaking. His vision was blurry. Sora brought him water and bread. He ate without tasting it. On the 3rd day, he turned his attention to the walls. This was more difficult. The castle walls were not made of wood, but of stone, thick, old. He couldn't visualize a stone wall with the same confidence as a wooden one. He knew wood. He knew less well, much less well. He struck carefully, one wall at a time. After each blow, he checked. He placed his palm against it. He listened. The first wall held up well. The crack closed. The stones settled. The second one, too. The third wall of the main hall. A blow. The stones shifted. Dan placed his palm on it and froze. Something was wrong. The hammer showed him. The wall looked even, but inside, deep within the masonry, the stones were laid incorrectly. The load wasn't going where it should. The upper stones were pressing down on the lower ones at the wrong angle. The wall was holding, for now. But in a year or two, under the weight of the roof and snow, it would crack again. Dan stood and looked at the wall. Cold sweat ran down his back. It was his mistake. He didn't know masonry well enough. He had visualized the wall incorrectly, and the hammer had built what he had visualized. Beautiful on the outside, dangerous on the inside. He sat down on the floor. The hammer lay in his hand, silent. The tool wasn't to blame. The master was. Dan sat and thought. Then he stood up. He walked over to the wall again. He placed his hand on it. He searched for the problem. He found it. The top row of stones. 7 stones that had been laid at an angle. He closed his eyes. He visualized only that section. 7 stones, the right angle, the right load. He wasn't sure he knew the right angle for the stone, but he knew physics. The load goes down. The stones must lie so that the weight is distributed evenly. Each stone rests on the 2 below it. A simple principle. He pictured it. He struck, gently, not with full force. 7 stones shifted. They stood up. Dan checked. The load was distributed correctly. The wall held. He exhaled. But he remembered the lesson. He doesn't build what he doesn't understand, period. Stone isn't his thing, not yet anyway. He needs to learn, or find someone who knows stone better than he does. That evening, he sat in the castle hall by the fireplace. The fireplace he'd repaired that morning was burning evenly and beautifully. The flames didn't smoke. The heat went into the room, not up the chimney. Evelyn came in. She sat down across from him. She was silent. Then she took her belt, a gold ring with a coat of arms. She placed it on the table in front of Dan. She said it was the Ashmore family heirloom, the only valuable thing left. She was offering it as payment. Dan looked at the ring, then at Evelyn, then at the ring again. He said he wouldn't take it. Evelyn frowned. She asked why. Dan said that the ring was her family, her history, her father. He doesn't take things like that. Evelyn looked at him for a long time. Then she put the ring away. She stood up. She walked to the door. She stopped. Without turning around, she said she would go with him. Dan asked where. Evelyn said wherever he was going. She had a name. The name Ashmore still meant something in the duchy. She could open doors that wouldn't open for him. She could speak to people who wouldn't listen to a builder. She could be useful. Dan was silent. Then he said he didn't need a name. He needed hands. If she was ready to work and not just talk, then she could come. Evelyn turned around. There was something new in her eyes. Not pride, not coldness, surprise. No one had ever set conditions for her before. She nodded. On the 4th day, Dan finished the castle. Not perfectly. He repaired the stone walls as best he could, with a mistake on that one wall and a correction. The stoves worked. The roof didn't leak. The stable stood. He completely rebuilt the staircase, because the staircase is wood, and wood is his. The castle didn't become a palace, but it became warm. It became safe. It became a home where one could live, not just survive. Baron Ashmore stood by the window. For the first time in a month, he was standing, not lying down. He looked out into the courtyard. Then he turned to Dan. He said that in the 40 years he'd lived in this castle, this was the first time he hadn't heard the wind in the walls. Dan nodded. He said the wind shouldn't be heard. The Baron smiled. Quiet. Tired, but alive. On the morning of the 5th day, they left Ashmore Castle. Dan, Sora, Evelyn. 3 horses, a hammer at his belt, maps in a tube, and the name Ashmore as a pass through the gates that wouldn't open for the builder. They were heading north. Dan, Sora, Evelyn. 3 people on 3 horses along a broken road. Evelyn rode in silence for the first 2 days. She wasn't used to the road. She wasn't used to sleeping on the ground. She wasn't used to eating crackers instead of bread. But she didn't complain. Not once. Dan noticed this and appreciated it. On the 3rd day of their journey, they saw smoke. Lots of smoke. Not from chimneys, from the ground. Up ahead on the road lay an overturned wagon. 3 men stood nearby, armed, swords, leather armor. Not soldiers, mercenaries. Dan stopped his horse. Sora did too. Evelyn rode forward. She recognized the markings on the wagon. It was a trade caravan from Calden. 2 wagons. One was lying on its side. The second was on fire. People were sitting in the snow nearby. The merchant and 2 of his men, bound. The mercenaries were looting the wagon. Evelyn turned to Dan. She said quietly that they needed to go around, that it wasn't their business, that the mercenaries were dangerous. Dan looked at the bound men, then at the mercenaries, then at the road. He wasn't a fighter. He was a foreman. He had a hammer, not a sword. 3 mercenaries with swords against a foreman with a hammer. The math was simple. But the bound men were sitting in the snow, and one of them was wounded, blood on his sleeve. Dan dismounted. Sora grabbed his sleeve. She said he was crazy. Dan didn't answer. He walked over to the overturned wagon. The mercenaries noticed him. One turned around, yelled at him to get lost. Dan stopped by the wagon, placed his hand on the side. The wagon was a structure, on wheels but with a roof and walls, enough for the hammer to feel it. Dan closed his eyes. He pictured the wagon, not just standing on wheels, but rebuilt. Thicker walls, higher sides, stronger planks, and one element that hadn't been there before, a bolt on the door, from the inside. He struck it. The van jerked. It rose onto its wheels with a crash. The sides grew taller. The planks darkened and closed together. The mercenaries jumped back. One of them cursed. All 3 stared at the van, then at Dan, then at the hammer in his hand. Dan stood calmly. He had know what to do next. The hammer wasn't a weapon. He couldn't hit a person with a hammer. Technically he could, but that wasn't part of his plan. The mercenaries exchanged glances. One stepped toward Dan, and then a woman emerged from behind the wagon, tall, in a gray robe, with a staff in her hand. Dan didn't see where she'd come from. He hadn't even noticed her on the road, as if she'd been standing behind the van the whole time, waiting. The woman said nothing. She simply took 3 steps forward. The staff in her hand swayed. The mercenary who was walking toward Dan stopped. He looked at the woman, at the staff, at her eyes, and took a step back. Dan didn't know what he saw in her eyes, but that was enough. The second mercenary reached for his sword. The woman moved so quickly that Dan didn't have time to realize what had happened. The staff traced an arc, a short one, a precise one. The mercenary folded in half. The sword fell into the snow. The third one ran. He simply turned and ran south along the road. The woman didn't chase after him. The first mercenary stood and watched his comrade lying in the snow, gasping for air. Then he looked at the woman. Then he ran too. He picked up his partner and ran. A minute later, they disappeared around the bend. Dan stood with the hammer in his hand and looked at the woman. She turned to him. Her face was calm, not a trace of tension, as if she hadn't just driven off 3 armed men with a single blow of her staff. She said her name was Min-soo Park, that she was a wandering nun, that she had been walking along the road and saw an overturned wagon, and she saw a man who approached the 3 armed men with a carpenter's hammer in his hand. She said it was either very brave or very foolish. Dan thought about it and said it was more likely the latter. Min-soo looked at him and smiled, just a little, the corner of her mouth. They untied the merchant and his men. Min-soo bandaged the wounded man's arm, calmly, skillfully. From a pouch on her belt, she took out some herbs. She applied them to the wound. She wrapped it with a clean cloth. The merchant thanked her. A lot, and for a long time. Min-soo listened patiently. Dan wasn't listening. He was examining the second wagon, the one that had been on fire. The fire had already gone out. The wagon was charred, but not completely. The frame remained. Dan placed his palm on it. He felt it. The wood was dead on one side, but the other side was alive. He could fix it. He pictured it. He struck it. The wagon stood up. The charred planks darkened even more, then lightened. The cracks closed. The wheels straightened. Not new, but serviceable. The merchant watched this and couldn't close his mouth. Then he fell to his knees. He started to say. Evelyn quietly translated for Dan that the merchant was calling him a messenger of the Zodchi. Dan grimaced, told him to get up, that he wasn't a messenger, that he just fixed the wagon, that the merchant better head to Calden and not stop. The merchant stood up, nodded, thanked. He drove off. Min-soo stayed behind. She said she was heading north, that it was on her way anyway, and that if these 3 were traveling the road, they might meet others. Dan looked at Sora. Sora shrugged. He looked at Evelyn. Evelyn was looking at Min-soo, with an expression Dan had already learned to read. Assessment. Weighing. Evelyn said that a nun who fights better than a soldier was a useful addition to the group. Min-soo looked at her, calmly, expressionless. She said she wasn't an addition. She was a person. Evelyn blinked, then nodded, apologized. Min-soo nodded back. They rode on, the 4 of them. On the 3rd day after meeting Min-soo, they saw horsemen. 6 of them, in identical cloaks, with a coat of arms on their chests. Evelyn recognized the coat of arms. Duke Morlander's men. Soldiers or messengers? They rode toward them, stopped. The leader asked who they were. Evelyn gave her name. The name Ashmore worked. The leader nodded. Then he looked at Dan, at the hammer on his belt. He asked if this was the builder everyone was talking about. Dan said nothing. Evelyn said that this was Master Dan, that he was heading north to help the villages. The leader looked at Dan for a long time. Then he said the Duke wanted to see him. That word had reached the capital, that the Duke was inviting the Master to Moorhold. the capital of the duchy. Evelyn turned to Dan. Her eyes said one thing. This is important. This is an opportunity. The Duke is power. Power is resources. Resources are people and tools and food and everything we need enough. Dan looked at the horsemen, then at the road, then at the map that Sora had silently unfolded before him. On the map, between them and Moorhold, lay 4 villages, 4 dots without crosses. 4 villages where people still lived. Dan told the horseman that he would be in Moorhold in a month. Maybe 2, when he finished his business on the road. The horseman frowned. He said the Duke wasn't used to waiting. Dan looked at him. He said the villages weren't used to waiting either. But they wait, every winter. He turned his horse and rode on. Evelyn rode alongside him. She was silent. Then she said quietly that he had just refused Duke Moorlander, that it was either very brave or very foolish. Dan smiled. He said that he'd already been told that today. Minsu laughed quietly behind him, for the first time in all the time he'd known her. They were riding north, the 4 of them, along the broken road, toward villages that were still smoldering. 6 months had passed since the day Dan woke up on the side of the road, 23 villages behind him, 140 houses repaired with a hammer, another 31 built by the hands of the people he had trained. 7 teams were working in the villages without him. Bren in Helland, Mira in Colmar, Wallace in Calden, Torin in Grunden, and 3 more whose names Sora had carefully written in the margins of her map. Dan didn't count his victories. He counted what he hadn't managed to do. There were more crosses on Sora's map, not fewer. Villages continued to freeze to death faster than he could reach them. Each cross represented people who hadn't waited for him. He didn't talk about it, but Sora saw how he looked at the map in the evenings, how his gaze lingered on the new crosses, how he clenched his jaw and remained silent. They were camped at a fork in the road, 4 of them by the fire. Dan, Sora, Evelyn, Minsu. Over the past 6 months, they had meshed together like cogs in a machine. Sora knew where to go. Evelyn knew who to talk to. Minsu knew who to beat up if talking didn't help. Dan knew what to build. But now they faced a choice. To the right, the road led to Greyhorn Pass and on to the ruins in the north. To the left, the road led to Moorhold, the capital of the duchy, where the Duke had summoned them twice already. The second messenger had found them a week ago. This time, the tone was less polite. The Duke wasn't asking. The Duke was expecting. Evelyn said they couldn't delay any longer, that there wouldn't be a 3rd invitation. There would be an order and soldiers. Dan sat by the campfire and stared into the flames. He didn't want to go to the capital. He knew what awaited him there, a polite cage, a golden chain, an honorary title, and a list of orders for the next 3 years. He'd seen it in Portland, when big companies bought up the best craftsmen. They signed exclusive contracts, and the craftsman no longer decided what to build. Others decided for him. Minsu sat across from him and cleaned her staff. She listened to the conversation, but didn't intervene. Then she said one thing. She said that there was a monastery hospital in Moorhold, and that children with frostbitten lungs were in that hospital, and that the hospital was falling apart, just like everything else in this duchy. Dan looked at her. Minsu was looking at the fire. Her face was calm. Her voice was steady. But Dan already knew her well enough to understand. When Minsu spoke of the children, her voice grew slightly softer, slightly more cautious, as if she feared her voice would break if she spoke louder. In the morning, they turned left, toward Moorhold. The duchy's capital turned out to be larger than Dan had expected. Stone walls 3 men high, 4 gates, towers. Inside, streets paved with stone, 2 and 3 story houses, a market, a cathedral, barracks, the Duke's palace on a hill in the center. Beautiful. From a distance. Up close, Dan saw what he always saw: cracks, rottenness, sagging foundations, clogged chimneys, crooked walls. The city was sick, just like the villages. It just hid its sickness behind a stone facade. They were met at the gate, a garrison officer, 4 soldiers. They escorted them through the city to the palace. People on the streets were watching. Some were pointing. Whispers spread through the crowd faster than they were walking. The builder, the very one, with the hammer. Dan walked without looking around. He looked at the walls, at the houses, at the roads. He counted in his head. There are hundreds of buildings here, thousands of people, and it's all falling apart. Duke Morlander turned out to be nothing like Dan had imagined. Not fat, not haughty. A tall, lean man in his 60s with a gray beard and dark eyes that held weariness. Real weariness. Not from boredom, but from work. He received them in the hall. A large one, a cold one, with a fireplace that was smoking. Dan automatically noted the clogged chimney and the uneven masonry of the arch. The Duke spoke at length. He spoke of snowy years, of villages dying out, about refugees heading south, about neighboring kingdoms waiting for Morlander to weaken enough to take his lands, about how he had neither money nor people nor time. Dan listened. Then the Duke fell silent. He looked at Dan. He asked what he could do. Dan looked at him, then at the hall, then at the smoking fireplace. He stood up. He walked over to the fireplace. He placed his palm on the stone. He closed his eyes. He visualized. He struck. The fireplace stopped smoking. The draft kicked in. Warmth poured into the hall. The Duke watched. His advisors watched. The soldiers at the door watched. Dan returned to his seat. He sat down. He said that this was what he could do, but not alone. He needed people, lots of people. Not 10, but 100. He needed tools, proper ones, iron ones. He needed a blacksmith who would forge nails and staples. He needed food for the crews. And he needed one thing that the Duke could give, but money couldn't buy. He needed permission to teach people to build, without the guild, without licenses, without seals. Anyone who wanted to learn, man or woman. The hall fell silent. The advisor to the Duke's left turned crimson. He was a member of the Masons Guild. Dan could tell by the badge on his chest. The Duke was silent for a long time. Then he asked one thing. He asked if Dan could repair the city wall, the northern one, the one that stands between Moorhold and the winter wind. If it collapsed, the city would freeze. Dan said he could. The Duke nodded. He said he would provide men, tools, food, and permission to teach. The guild advisor stood up and left the hall. Dan watched him go. He realized he had just made an enemy, a serious one. But he had no choice. He started that very day. The northern wall of Moorhold, 300 meters, 6 meters high, 2 meters thick, cracks running its entire length. In 2 places, the wall had sagged half a meter. Dan stood before it and calculated. The Caldon wall was 150 meters, and he'd been bedridden for 3 days. Here, it was 300, twice as long, twice as high, twice as thick. He couldn't do it in a week, not even in 2. He needed a month. And even then, he'd be out of commission for a long time afterward. He turned to Sora. He said quietly that he needed help, not with a hammer, with people. Sora nodded. She already knew what to do. 3 days later, a crew of 50 people was working on the north wall. Dan hammered in the mornings, 1 section a day, 10 meters, 1 blow. The rest of the time, he worked with the people, showing them, explaining, teaching. Evelyn negotiated with the suppliers, food, tools, materials. Her name and her way of speaking worked wonders. Merchants who turned down a simple builder couldn't refuse Baroness Ashmore. Minsu kept order, quietly, without words, but everyone knew that the nun with the staff was more than just a herbalist. And it was during the second week of work in Moorhold that a young woman approached the wall. Short, muscular, wearing a leather apron over her shirt. Her hands were covered in burns and old cuts. She stood there, watching the crew work. Then she walked up to Dan. She said she was a blacksmith, that her name was Haley North, that she'd heard he needed nails. Dan looked at her hands, at the burns, at the calluses, at the short, strong fingers accustomed to the hammer. He said he didn't just need nails. He needed staples, hinges, bolts, fasteners for rafters, and someone who can forge all of that quickly and in large quantities. Haley smiled. She said she could do that, if they gave her a proper forge and not that dump she's working in now. Dan asked what was wrong with her forge. Haley said the bellows were cracked. The bellows were torn. The anvil was crooked because the floor had sagged. The roof was leaking. And anyway, the smithy wasn't hers, but her father's. And her father had gone blind 3 years ago. And ever since then, half the town had thought she was just pretending to be a blacksmith. Dan looked at her.
Then he told her to lead him to the smithy. The smithy stood on the edge of the craftsman's quarter, small, crooked, with a leaky roof. Dan went inside. It was dark inside. The bellows were cracked down the middle. The anvil stood on the stump that had rotted and tilted. The tools hung on the wall in strict order, each in its place, clean, oiled, well-maintained. Dan looked at the tools, then at Haley. A man who keeps his tools like this isn't just playing at being a blacksmith. He placed his palm on the smithy wall. The hammer showed. The walls were thin but sturdy. The roof was full of holes. The floor had sagged in 3 places, but the foundation was solid. A master had built it, long ago, but with skill. Dan closed his eyes. He pictured the forge. Not a castle forge, not a city forge, a working forge, a field forge, the kind he'd seen dozens of times on construction sites where they had to forge right on the spot. Sturdy walls, good ventilation,
A bellows in the center with proper draft, an anvil on a stone base, shelves for tools, a place for coal, a place for work pieces.
He struck it. The smithy shuddered. The walls straightened. The roof settled evenly. The forge reassembled itself, solid, sturdy. The anvil settled onto the stone cube, level, secure. The floor leveled out. Haley stood in the middle of the new smithy. She touched the forge, the anvil, the walls. Then she turned to Dan. Her eyes were shining. She opened her mouth, closed it. Then she said one word. "Thank you." And immediately added that tomorrow morning he would have his first 50 nails. Dan nodded. He walked out. Behind him, Haley was already stoking the forge. The wall took a month, 30 hammer blows, 1 a day, 300 meters. Dan worked like a machine. A blow in the morning, then training the crew, in evening and inspection. At night, he lay there and couldn't move. By the end of the month, he had lost 10 kilograms. His face was gaunt, dark circles under his eyes. His hands shook even on his days off. Sora made him eat. Minsu made him sleep. Evelyn made him not work on Sundays. Haley hammered. Every day. Nails, staples, hinges, fasteners. 50 nails on the first day. Then 100. Then 200. She worked like a woman possessed. Dan would stop by her forge to check on the order and find her at the anvil at 3 in the morning. He'd tell her to go to sleep. She'd reply that just 5 more and she'd be done. An hour later, he'd return, and she'd still be standing at the anvil. They were alike. Neither of them knew how to stop. In the 3rd week in Moorhold, what Dan had been waiting for and dreading happened.
A man from the Masons Guild came to see him, not the counselor who had left the hall. Another one, young, polite. He introduced himself as a third-level apprentice. He said that Master Corvin, the guild's head, wanted to speak with him. Dan agreed. The meeting took place in the guild building, a large stone house in the city center. Beautiful, old, with coats of arms on the walls and mosaics on the floor. Dan entered and placed his palm on the wall. A habit. The building was ailing, like everything here. The foundation had settled on the south side. The roof was leaking over the east wing. 3 of the 5 fireplaces didn't work. Master Corvin the Elder sat at a large table in the main hall. An elderly man in his 70s, lean, upright, with a mason's hands, large, heavy, covered in old calluses and scars. He wasn't a bureaucrat. He was a master who had become a bureaucrat, and that made him more dangerous. Corvin looked at Dan in silence for a long time. Then he spoke. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He spoke quietly and evenly. He said he knew who Dan was, that he'd heard about every village, about every house, about every blow of the hammer, and that with every blow, Dan was killing the craft the guild had preserved for 400 years. Dan listened. Corvin continued. He said that a stonemason trains for 20 years. 20 years to understand stone, to feel the mortar, to know how each block will fit, and that one man with a magic hammer does in a minute what a master spends a year on. He asked what would happen when people stopped learning. Why learn for 20 years if you can just call a man with a hammer? He asked what would happen when Dan died, or left, or breaks down. Who will build then, if there are no masters left because no one wanted to learn? Dan was silent. Corvin was telling the truth, and Dan knew it. He'd seen it in Portland. When prefab homes and modular structures arrived, half the crews were left without work. Young people weren't going into the trade. Why learn if a machine can do it faster? And then the machine broke down, and there was no one to fix it. Dan replied. He said the master was right, that a hammer is dangerous, that he knew that himself, that he'd already seen where it leads when a tool replaces the craftsman. Corvin looked at him in surprise. He hadn't expected agreement. Dan continued. He said that was exactly why he taught people, not the hammer, with their hands. Every village, every town. He kept for himself the crews that built without magic. Slower, worse, but on their own. He used the hammer where people otherwise wouldn't survive until spring, where there's no time to teach, where it's needed today, not in 20 years. He said he wasn't taking the craft away from the guild. He was asking the guild to come with him and teach those who don't have 20 years. They have 1 winter. Corvin was silent. His face was expressionless. Then he stood up. He walked to the window. He looked out at the city. Dan waited. Corvin said he wouldn't go with him, that the guild was order and Dan was chaos, that order and chaos don't go hand in hand. Dan stood up. He walked over to the wall of the hall, the one that had sagged on the south side. He placed his palm on it. Then he turned to Corvin. He said that the guild building's foundation had sagged, that the roof was leaking, that 3 fireplaces weren't working, and that the guild masters, who had preserved their craft for 400 years, couldn't repair their own home. Corvin turned away from the window. His face changed. Dan raised his hammer. He looked at Corvin. He asked for permission. Corvin was silent for 10 seconds. Then he nodded. With a single movement, a short one, Dan struck. The guild building shook. The foundation straightened. The wall stood upright. The ceiling stopped sagging. A minute later, the building stood as good as new. just like 400 years ago. Dan turned to Corvin. The master stood by the window, looking at the wall that had just been crooked and was now straight. He placed his palm on it, just as Dan had done, touching the stone, feeling it. Then he removed his hand. He turned to Dan. His eyes were wet. He said nothing. Neither did Dan. He turned and walked out. He didn't take any money. He didn't ask for anything. He just fixed it and left. The next day, 23 masons from the guild came to the north wall with their tools. They silently lined up in their work crews. Wallace, who had arrived from Calden by then, looked at them, then at Dan. Then he smiled. Corvin hadn't come, but he hadn't forbidden it either. The guild had split. Half had gone with Dan, half had stayed with Corvin. War hadn't broken out, but the silence between the two halves was heavy and cold. A year had passed. Dan stood at the edge of a convoy of 4 wagons and counted the people. 32 apprentices, 7 teams working throughout the duchy, 4 masters who were already teaching others. The pyramid was growing, slowly, but it was growing. The convoy was heading east, toward the ruins of Kale, one of the 13 great cities. The idea wasn't his, the idea was Sora's. She said that if Dan wanted to build something that would stand on its own without him, he needed a base, not a village, not a city on foreign soil, a place of his own. A place where he could teach, to build, to demonstrate, and from which teams would fan out across the north like ripples on water. Kale had stood empty for 500 years. Ruins, stones, remnants of walls. But the location was good. A river, a hill, shelter from the wind, and enough stone around to build 10 cities. 2 more people had joined the caravan in the last month. Jisoo Ryo was the first to arrive, a quiet girl with fingers stained black with coal. She was 19 but looked 15, small, thin, with big eyes that looked at the world cautiously, as if from a hiding place. She hardly spoke, but she drew. Dan first saw her drawings when she approached the crew in one of the villages and silently handed him a sheet of paper. On the sheet was a house. The house he had built yesterday, but drawn so well that Dan stopped and stared at it for a minute without looking away. Every line was in the right place. Every proportion was exact. But it wasn't just a drawing. It was a blueprint, with dimensions that Jisoo had somehow determined by eye, with a cross-section, with a top view. Dan asked who had taught her. Jisoo shook her head. No one. She just saw it and drew it. Dan began to explain things to her, not like a master to an apprentice, like a man who had met for the first time someone who saw buildings the same way he did. He spoke in words. She responded with drawings. A week later, he realized that she was drawing what he was explaining better than he could imagine it himself. It was a strange feeling, as if he'd found a translator for a language he'd been thinking in his whole life but couldn't speak. Jisoo was afraid of enclosed spaces, afraid of loud voices, afraid of men. The first few days, she flinched every time Dan raised his voice on the construction site. Then she got used to it. Then she stopped flinching. Dan didn't ask why. Sora told him quietly one evening. Jisoo's village burned down. Mercenaries. The first snowy year. She was the only one who survived. She hid in the cellar. Dan listened in silence. Then he stood up. He went to the van Jisoo had ridden in. He worked there for 2 hours. With his hands. Without a hammer. He rebuilt the corner of the wagon. He made her a small private space, with a shelf for papers, with a hook for a coal cup, and with a window. A small one, but enough to see the sky. Always. Jisoo returned in the evening. She saw it. She stood silently. Then she sat down in her new spot, looked out the window, and for the first time in 2 years, she fell asleep without a candle. The second was Arya Solon. She didn't just show up, she came, on purpose. A tall, pale woman in black, with cold eyes and slender fingers stained with ink. She introduced herself. the last of the royal architects of the great cities era.
Dan didn't understand what that meant. Sora explained quietly. The Solon family had kept the architect's blueprints for 500 years, generation after generation. They studied, they copied, they studied, they waited for the Zodji to return. Arya was the last. She knew the architecture of the former era better than any living person. She grew up in the library. She read every text. She studied every blueprint. She had spent her whole life preparing for the moment when the Zodji would come. And here he was. And he turned out to be a tired American foreman with a worn-out hammer who didn't know half the terms and didn't give a damn about half the traditions. Arya looked at Dan with such contempt that even Evelyn next to her seemed warm. She said she'd seen his work, that his houses were sturdy but primitive, that he built like a barbarian, that he didn't understand proportions, didn't know the laws of harmony, didn't feel the stone. Dan listened. Then he said she was right, that he didn't know the stone, that his houses were simple, and that the people in those simple houses don't freeze. Arya fell silent. They rode side by side for 2 days without speaking. On the third day, Dan found a bundle of blueprints among her things. She had left it on a bench in the bakery where they had spent the night. Dan unwrapped it and froze. It was a bridge across a gorge, long, elegant, with arches that carried the road 30 meters above the ground. Every arch was calculated. Every span was calibrated. It wasn't a sketch. It was a blueprint, precise, detailed, beautiful, and absolutely impossible in the opinion of any sane engineer. Except for one. Dan looked at the drawing and saw the bridge. He saw how it could be built. He saw one mistake. The third arch, too thin at the base. It wouldn't hold the load when the road was fully loaded. Everything else was right, brilliant, unbelievably beautiful, and yet engineering accurate. He found Arya. She was sitting by the fire, reading a book. Dan placed the drawing in front of her. Arya looked up. She saw her own drawing. Her face froze. She reached out to take it. Dan didn't give it to her. He said it could be built. Arya stopped. She looked at him. Dan said she had made one mistake. The third arch. The base needed to be widened by a third. The rest was correct. He asked when she had drawn it. Arya was silent. Then she said it was her thesis project, 15 years ago. Her professors called it a fantasy. They said it was impossible to build, that she had her head in the clouds. Dan placed his hand on the drawing. He looked her in the eyes. He said her professors were wrong, that the bridge could be built, and he asked if she wanted to go with him and build it. Arya looked at him for a long time. Then her eyes changed. Something in them broke, and something grew in its place. She realized that all her life she hadn't been waiting for the architect. She had been waiting for a person who would look at her blueprint and say yes. Let's build it. She nodded. A convoy of 4 vans was heading toward Oren Kale. Dan, Sora, Evelyn, Minsu, Haley, Jisoo, Arya. 7 of them. And 32 students. Ahead lay the ruins of a city that was 500 years old, and a plan that was 1 day old. Oren Kale greeted them with silence. The ruins lay in a wide valley between the river and a ridge of hills. Stone, lots of stone. Walls waist high, chest high, shoulder high. Remnants of streets buried in earth and snow. Arches leading nowhere. Foundations of houses that hadn't existed for 500 years. Dan stood on the hill and looked down. He saw a city. Not ruins, a city. Streets, squares, houses. He saw them because the stones told him so. Here was the main street. Here was the square. Here was the market.
Here stood a large house, perhaps the town hall, perhaps a temple. He placed his palm on the nearest wall.
The hammer showed him something he hadn't expected. The stone was alive. Not in the human sense, but the stone remembered. The hammer sensed the imprint of its former shape within it, like the trace of a painting on a wall. The stones remembered what they used to be, and they wanted to return to that state. Dan removed his hand. He looked at the hammer, then at the ruins, then at his team standing behind him. 7 women, 32 students, and him. He said they wouldn't rebuild the city with the hammer. Arya turned to him, her eyes narrowed. She asked why. Dan explained, "The hammer builds what it knows. It doesn't know this city, doesn't know what it looked like, doesn't know its logic. If it strikes and tries to imagine the city from the remains of the stones, the result won't be Orenkale, but its fantasy of the city, beautiful on the outside, and perhaps dangerous on the inside." Arya was silent. Then she nodded. She understood. Dan said they would build with their hands, using blueprints, using their knowledge. The hammer only where there wasn't enough time otherwise. The first month they cleared the site. Shovels, wheelbarrows, ropes, hands, 32 apprentices and 7 masters, every day from dawn till dusk. They uncovered the city from beneath the earth and snow. Arya walked the cleared streets with a sketchbook and drew. She studied the masonry. She studied the style. She studied techniques she'd only seen in books. Her eyes were ablaze. For the first time in all the time Dan had known her, she was alive. Not cold, not aloof, alive. Jisoo followed behind Arya and drew what Arya described in words. Together, they created blueprints. Arya knew what the city was supposed to look like. Jisoo could draw it. Dan watched their work and realized that together they were stronger than he was alone. Much stronger. In the second month, they began to build. The first quarter, 12 houses around the square. Haley hammered day and night. Nails, staples, hinges, tools. She set up her forge right in the square and worked in full view of everyone. The clang of the hammer on the anvil became the sound that woke the camp every morning. Evelyn left for Moorhold for a week. She returned with 3 wagons of grain, 2 barrels of salt, and the Duke's permission for Orenkale to be settled by refugees from the north. She didn't say how she'd gotten it, but Dan could see she'd come back exhausted. Dark circles under her eyes. Her voice was hoarse. She had bargained, argued, persuaded, used every weapon she had. Her name, her manners, logic, and sheer stubbornness. Minsu organized a shelter. In the very first house that had been completed. She said the children wouldn't wait until the city was ready. The children were freezing right now. Dan allocated a house to her. Minsu set it up in a day. Beds, a stove, a kitchen, a supply of firewood. And a week later, 11 children were living in the orphanage. Orphans from the north. Minsu fed them, treated them, put them to bed. And every morning she stood at the door with a staff in her hand and watched the construction site. She didn't help, she stood guard. Sora worked on the map. Not the map of the duchy, the map of the city. She marked every house, every street, every well. The map of Orenkale grew along with the city. The third month. Dan began using a hammer, precisely. Foundations that needed leveling, walls that needed to be raised before the snow fell, a well, a bakery, a common hall. Every blow was measured. Every blow according to Arya and Jisoo's blueprints. Every blow was checked 3 times before the hammer touched the stone. He remembered the wall at Ashmore Castle, remembered the mistake, remembered the cold sweat. Never again. In the 4th month, the first refugees arrived. 20 people, families from the north, with children, with bundles, with eyes that held the same emptiness as in Grundon.
They stood in the square and looked at the houses, at the new houses, at the roofs that didn't leak, at the doors that closed, at the stoves from which smoke rose, proper, even smoke. Dan stood in the square and watched them. Then he pointed to the 12 houses in the first block. He said those were their homes, that they could go inside and live there. A woman holding a child in her arms walked up to the nearest house. She opened the door. She went inside. She came out a minute later. Her face was wet. She didn't say a word. She just held the child tighter and went back inside, and didn't come out. Dan watched and felt something tighten in his chest. Not from joy, from the weight of it all. 12 houses, 20 people, and in the north, thousands who won't make it, for whom he won't build, whom he won't save. He stood in the square of the new city and thought of those who weren't there. And then news came from Helland. The messenger made it in 3 days on a worn-out horse. Helland was burning. The guild's mercenaries. Those who had stayed with Corvin. Not Corvin himself, his men. Those who decided that if Dan couldn't be stopped with words, he could be stopped with fire. They came to Helland at night, set 5 houses ablaze, the very ones Dan had built first. Theo and Lena's house, the bakery, 3 houses by the square. Bren tried to stop them. They beat him. He lay there with broken ribs. People put out the fire, but half the village was reduced to ashes. Dan listened to the messenger. His face didn't change. But Sora, standing nearby, saw his hands. His fists were clenched so tight his nails dug into his palms. Blood on his fingers. He said nothing. He walked to the horse. Sora followed him. Minsu followed Sora. Haley wanted to go. Dan told her to stay, to forge, to build, not to stop. The city won't wait. Evelyn stayed behind to oversee the construction. Arya and Jisoo stayed with the blueprints. The 3 of them set out at night. By dawn of the 2nd day, they were in Helland. Helland stood black. Dan saw it from the hill and stopped his horse. 5 houses had burned to the ground. 3 more were damaged. The bakery he had built in 3 strokes and lay in for 2 hours afterward. Theo and Lena's house, which he had erected with his very first stroke in this world. All charred skeletons in the snow. People sat in the square. In that very square where a year ago they had eaten hot bread together for the first time. Now they sat in the snow by fires they had built from the rubble of their own homes. Dan dismounted. He walked through the village. In silence. People looked up at him. They recognized him. Some stood up. Some cried. Some remained silent. Bren was lying in a house that had survived. His ribs were bandaged. His face was swollen. He saw Dan and tried to sit up. Dan put his hand on his shoulder, told him to lie down. Bren said he couldn't stop them, that there were 8 of them, with torches, at night. He ran out and they knocked him down right away. Dan nodded. He said that Bren had done everything he could, and that broken ribs were proof, not a disgrace. Minsu examined Bren, changed his bandages, gave him herbs, said the ribs would heal, that the boy was tough. Dan went out to the square, walked around the ruins, approached Theo and Lena's house. The charred wall stood like a monument, the only thing left of that first house. Dan placed his hand on it. The hammer showed him dead wood, embers, ashes, nothing alive, nothing that could be fixed. Lena approached. She was 9. She had grown over the past year, taller, stronger, but her eyes were the same, big, dark. She tugged at his sleeve, asked if he would fix it. Dan crouched down in front of her, looked into her eyes. He could. He could strike with the hammer and rebuild the house in a minute, just like the first time. But he'd been thinking about it the whole way from Oren Kale, 2 days in the saddle,
And he'd been thinking one thing. A hammer is quick. But quick doesn't mean right. He told Lena he'd fix it, but not with a hammer. He said a hammer is quick, but he wants her to have a house that will stand even if he's never here again. So he'll build it with his hands, with everyone, and she'll help too. Lena looked at him. Then she nodded. Seriously, like a grown-up. Dan stood up. He turned toward the village, toward the people sitting in the snow. He spoke loudly so everyone could hear. He said they would build, together, without magic. He would show them how. They would do it. And what they built with their own hands, no arsonist could take away, because they would know how to build again and again and again, as many times as it takes. Silence. Then Garrett stood up. Old Garrett, his eyes red from the smoke. He didn't say anything. He just picked up an axe and stood next to Dan. Theo stood behind him. The boy was 9. He was too small for an axe. But he stood up. Then the others stood up, one by one. Women, men, old people, even children. Even Bren, who came out holding onto the wall and whom Min-Soo immediately sat back down with a stern look. They were building spring. All of spring. March, April, May. Dan showed them, explained. He knelt in the mud and together with the people laid the foundation, stone by stone, log by log, nail by nail. Haley sent 3 boxes of nails and staples from Oren Kale with a note. The note had one word: hang in there. Dan read it and smiled. Sora drew house plans, simple ones, easy to understand, so that anyone could look at them and understand. Min-Soo treated those who were sick. She cooked meals. She made sure the children ate. And she stood at the edge of the village every night with a staff in her hand. Dan didn't use a hammer even once, not a single blow, all spring long. The houses grew slowly, crooked. The first wall Theo built collapsed on the second day. The boy stood and looked at the pile of logs. Dan walked over. He said his first wall had collapsed too, 20 years ago. And the second one too. But the third one stood. Theo looked at him. Then he started over. The third wall stood. By the end of May, the village stood. Not as beautiful as it was after the hammer. The walls were slightly crooked. The roofs weren't perfect. The stoves smoked more than they should. But the houses were warm, sturdy, alive. And they were built by the hands of the people who lived in them. Dan stood on the hill and looked at Helland. New Helland. The third version of this village. The first was built by frost and poverty. The second was built by the hammer. The third was built by people. And the third was the best of all. Not because the walls were straighter, not because the roofs were sturdier, but because every person in every house knew how that house stood. They knew every nail, every log, every stone in the foundation, and they could fix any of them, without Dan, without a hammer, simply because someone had once shown them how. They returned to Oren Kale at the beginning of summer. The town was growing. Evelyn had managed. The second block was almost finished. Arya and Jisoo worked non-stop. Haley was forging. Wallace brought 20 more people from Calden. Garrett from Helland sent Brenna and 4 men who wanted to continue their training. People were coming from all over the duchy. Not because Dan had called them. He hadn't called them. They came on their own. Because the word had spread from village to village, not about the magic hammer, about the man who teaches how to build. A year and 8 months had passed. Dan stood on the wall of the third quarter of Oren Kale and looked out over the city. Below, people walked along the new street. Refugees from the north, merchants from Calden, apprentices from a dozen villages.
200 people lived here permanently. Another 100 came and went. In the bakery built by Wallace's crew, Old North baked bread.
Haley's father, blind, but his hands remembered dough as they had once remembered iron. Haley had brought him a month ago. He stood in the middle of the new bakery and listened. He listened to the oven humming, to the fire crackling, to the smell of flour. And he said it was a good oven, that whoever built it knew what they were doing. Haley stood nearby and said nothing. Then Dan led the old man into Haley's smithy. He placed his hand on the anvil, told him to listen. Haley took the hammer and began to forge. Old North listened. 3 blows, 5, 10. Then he said quietly, "Daughter, you're better than me." That evening, Haley went out to check on the wagon train. She returned an hour later. She didn't say a word. She just sat down next to Dan by the fire and leaned her shoulder against him. 2 years. Dan found the diary. Not by himself. Arya found it. In the library they dug out from under the rubble of the East Wing, an old book in a leather binding. Arya brought it over with trembling hands. She said it was the diary of the last architect, the one who lived here 500 years ago. Dan read it for 3 nights. Sora helped with the translation, an old dialect. Arya helped with the terms. The diary told a story, the story of a man who received the hammer, who built, who helped, who was great, and who one day began to build for himself a palace, huge, beautiful, his own. And the hammer brought that palace crashing down on his head. The last entry in the diary was short. The hammer loves those who build for others. When you start building for yourself, give it back right away. Dan closed the diary. He sat in the dark. The hammer lay nearby, warm, quiet. And Dan thought. He thought about how, in 2 years in this world, he had never once built a home for himself. Not once. He slept in other people's homes, in vans, on the floor by stoves, in bakeries, by campfires. He built for Lena, for Theo, for Garrett, for Father Evelyn,
For Blind North. For the children at the Minsao orphanage. For hundreds of people whose names he remembered. But not for himself. And he realized that this was no accident. It was a condition. The hammer had chosen him because he didn't build for himself. His whole life, 15 years in Portland, every house for someone else, every porch for someone else's mother. Except one. That very one. The one he promised to his own, and didn't finish. The hammer found him through death, through that last thought of the unfinished porch, through the promise he didn't have time to fulfill. For 500 years, the artifact had been searching for a man who knew the craft with his hands and did not want to own what he built, and who had promised someone to finish it and didn't make it in time. Dan sat in the dark and thought about his mom, about the porch, about the fact that she was waiting, and that there was nothing he could do about it. Except one thing, to keep doing here what he knew how to do. In the morning, he went out to the square. A winter dawn, the snow was falling softly, settling on the new tiled roofs. The first residents were walking down a street that hadn't existed 6 months ago. Refugees for whom Evelyn had secured the right to settle here. In the bakery, Old North was baking bread. By the well, Sora was teaching Lena to read a map. Lena had arrived a week ago with Theo and Garrett. They had decided to live here. In the drafting tower, Arya and Jisoo were arguing over a sketch of the 4th quarter. Minsu was handing out hot milk to the children at the shelter. Haley was forging, as always. Dan was walking through the city they had built. Not just him, all of them, with their hands, following the blueprints, following the nails, following the stones, following the knowledge he had passed on and that now lived in hundreds of hands. He walked and saw smoke rising from properly built stoves.
He saw doors that closed tightly.
He saw windows behind which it was warm, and he walked toward a small house on the corner of the square. A house he hadn't built. A house he hadn't asked for. A house that had appeared without his knowledge. A sign hung above the door, Master Dan's house. Jisoo had painted the sign. Dan recognized her handwriting. He stood in front of the door, a hammer in his hand, the diary in his memory. He knew that if he went inside, if he accepted this house, if he called it his own, the hammer might kill him, just as it had killed the one before. He stood there for a long time. Snow fell on his shoulders. Then he opened the door. It was warm inside. The stove was burning. Hot tea in 7 mugs stood on the table. All 6 of them were sitting and waiting. Sora by the window with a map on her lap. Evelyn by the wall, upright and serious. Minsu by the stove, calm as always. Haley on the floor with her legs crossed. Jisoo in the corner with a notebook.
Ari sat at the table with a blueprint. They looked at him. Dan stood in the doorway. Evelyn spoke without looking up. She said they had built it for him, not with a hammer, with their hands, so he could accept it, because this wasn't a house he had built for himself. It was a house built for him, by those for whom he had built. Dan was silent. He looked at the stove that was warm, at the walls that stood straight, at the ceiling that didn't leak, at the tea steaming in 7 mugs, at the 6 pairs of eyes looking at him and waiting. He placed the hammer on the shelf by the door, not out of fear, not because the diary told him to, because here it wasn't needed. Here, everything had been built without him, for him. He sat down at the table. He picked up a mug. The tea was hot. Haley had brewed it. He recognized her way of brewing, strong, bitter, with the herbs Minsu had given him. He drank in silence. Then he said one word, "Thank you," and added that he'd just been wondering where to warm up. Haley laughed. Loudly. Out loud. The way she always laughed. Sora smiled. Quietly. Just the corners of her lips. Evelyn looked up. Something glistened in her eyes that she would never call tears. Minsu nodded. Calmly, as if everything was going according to plan. Jisoo drew something in her notebook. Then she turned it toward Dan. A drawing. 7 people at a table in a small house. Snow outside the window. Smoke from the chimney. Warmth. Arya sat silently. Then she said they needed to discuss the 4th quarter in the morning, and that she had finally solved the problem with the 3rd arch in the bridge design. She widened the base by a 3rd, just as he had said. Dan looked at her, nodded, said they'd discuss it in the morning. Tea now. The hammer lay on the shelf by the door and glowed softly. Not from a blow, not from magic. Just like that. A warm, even light, like a well-built stove, like a house that stands properly, like a tool that has found its master and agrees with what the master does. Snow was falling outside the window, soft, even. It settled on the tiled roofs of the new city, on the streets where people will walk tomorrow, on the walls that will stand for 100 years, and 200, and 500, because they were not built for glory, not for money, not for themselves. They were built for the people who live in them, by name, one by one. And in a small house on the corner of the square, Daniel Crow was drinking tea in his own home, in a house built for him by those for whom he had built. And it was the only house the hammer allowed him to accept, because it was a house not for himself, but from others. And the hammer didn't forbid that. Snow was falling. The stoves were warm. The city stood. Everything was built on an honest foundation.